So, do you know that you're on the hook for government employees' retirement? Oh, you're on the hook. To talk about it, Joshua Scharf with the Independence Institute is keeping an eye on what's called PARA. PARA stands for?
The Public Employees Retirement Association.
For those people who don't get that, what is it?
That's the public employees' pensions for the state. The two biggest funds for that are the state employees and the teachers, the public schools. Those are far and away the biggest funds, but it also covers judges, it covers policemen, and, state troopers.
So while most of the world, most of the country, employees help their employees, or the employers help their employees with a 401k plan, which is you put some money aside, we'll put some money aside, and it's yours. You get to keep it. If you leave, you take the whole thing, and as soon as we put it in, it's yours. Government pensions are really old school, which is you work long enough, don't worry, when you retire, we'll take care of you.
Basically, it's a promise of an annuity. And so instead, based on your age and how many years you've worked when you retire. So instead of being a piece of an asset, public employees are getting a piece of a promise. And it's up to us to kind of figure out how much that promise is really worth.
And the taxpayers on the hook to pay for the promise, along with the contributions that employees have made.
Right. So the biggest thing is what we talk about investment risk. If you don't get the returns that you need in order to keep these promises, then communities end up being on the hook for that. Now, sometimes employees may not see everything they think they were promised, but by and large, communities will suddenly find themselves putting money into the classrooms that doesn't make it to the classrooms, that ends up making it to backfill these promises that somebody else made.
So it's a little different. I remember when United Airlines, their pension, when they went bankrupt, their pension collapsed, and their retirees got cut in half what they were promised, and then they got cut in half again. They just got a fraction of what they were promised, and their retirements were destroyed. But that was a private company. The government is a public entity and will always have a way to pull some money. All right. Let me ask you about...
In theory, unless you're Illinois, keep an eye on that. They just, this week, there were some developments in terms of them saying that they're not going to be able to pay certain bills. Not necessarily pension bills, but that's a big part of why.
At the same time, they also just raised taxes to cover those pensions.
Yep.
So,
and people are fleeing, and that's what happens.
That's what happens, and I don't want them fleeing here when the bill comes through. What is the bill, by the way? How far behind is PARA from being fully funded?
They will say it's about $30 billion. We think it's closer to $60 billion. So to put that in real numbers, that's about $30,000 per Colorado household. Now, it's a long-term bill. It's not like a credit card bill where, hi, tomorrow we need the money. It's a long-term bill. So the way to think about it is it's about the cost of a nice kitchen makeover, except you don't get the new kitchen. You just get the bill.
My kitchen makeover was $10 grand. What kind of house do you live in? All right, let's talk about
one that I would need $30,000 if I wanted to live in that house. Right?
Talk to me about the communication between PARA and the employees, our employees.
Right. So
they want to listen. I like that. They want to listen.
Yeah, they sort of went on a whistle-stop tour, a listening tour. Excuse me, listening tour. So what happened at the end, near the end of last year? The PARA board re-evaluated its view of reality, if you will, how they were measuring these things that are out there that they can't control. One was the rate of return. They lowered that. It had been as high as 8.5% in the distant past of 2002, 2003. Now it's down to a 7.25%.
For people who might not be following that, while the rest of us were getting 0.1% return on our savings accounts and maybe 3-4% in our 401ks, if depending on where we were investing, PARA was doing their projections on an 8% investment return, which nobody was really getting. And they actually had to even lower that, and it's still, I think, way too high.
Well, what they've done is over time, they've lowered that, and they've been slow to do it, but now they're at 7.25%. The other thing they did was adopt new actuarial tables, which acknowledge the fact that people are living longer. Again, they were living longer, 2 or 3 years ago, but now they finally decided to adopt those tables. What that meant was that suddenly they found that the two biggest funds, the state fund and the school fund, would, instead of being fully funded in 30 years, which is the target, would suddenly not be fully funded for 75 years, meaning that people who would be, finishing out their retirement haven't been born yet in terms of the school fund. And people.
Let me see if I got this. So we're going to be dependent on people who aren't born yet to help pay for people who are going to be retiring now.
No, somebody who is born today, who goes
Yeah.
to work for the schools, will be near the end of their life before para is fully funded, before the school fund is fully funded. The state
Wow.
fund's a little better, 55 years, so they'll
okay.
sort of be near the end of
Yeah.
retirement,
There we go.
or be to the point where they would retire. But really bad news for that, because it makes them very fragile and it makes them very susceptible to downturns in the market. So they went on a listening tour, quote
para.
unquote, in order to, it was my experience. I attended one in Colorado Springs and I attended one of their sessions in Denver as well. And the impression that I got was that the two biggest things that they could do to help solve this problem over the long term, they simply took off the table. They are absolutely committed to retaining this defined benefit conventional pension instead of converting over to a 401k style plan. And there was considerable resistance to the idea of raising the retirement age. Right now, you and I retire, Social Security retirement age is 67 years old. That may or may not be realistic, but that's what Social Security
and that
assumes.
will be forced up. There's no other way around it.
I think it has to be.
Yeah.
The average age, according to PARA's own CAFR, Comprehensive Annual Financial Report, the audited report, according to their own numbers, the average age of retirement for a PARA member is 58 at retirement.
Holy crap.
Average
All right,
age
let's stop
at
there for a
retirement.
second, because we don't get retirement benefits from Social Security for another 11 years.
Nine.
Is it 9?
67,
All right.
yeah,
All
it's
right.
nine.
9 years from when a government employee.
He was told there wouldn't be math.
Yeah, I
It's
didn't.
okay.
I went to a government school. Anyway, actually the nuns would be very disappointed in me. So we're going to be working for an extra 9 years while government employees from Colorado will be retired receiving those benefits.
On average.
On
yes.
average.
Yeah.
Pardon me to sound like a 12-year-old, but that ain't fair.
It is not. It is not fair to the communities who have to pay for this. It's not fair for individuals who find themselves continuing to work to pay for that. And it's also, the way the system is set up, it's also not fair to retirees, because the benefits that they see are often, like I say, promises that were made by somebody else. Now, a third party, the communities end up having to cover these promises, and the basic structure ends up being in the hands of politicians. Now, because the legislature sets all of this stuff, it's a real problem. But they simply took those things off the
The
table.
most important reforms. In other words, the earlier they retire, by the way, the longer the rest of us in the private sector have to work to pay off
Sure,
those things.
because they're
So
not putting into
or
the
the easier
system,
thing
right?
to say is you have to work longer because they're retiring earlier. So the two obvious fixes to this is to bring up their retirement age, like we are putting up our retirement age in Social Security, and like almost everyone else in the world, move their pensions, which is promises, to actual cash in their IRA/401k accounts. That's theirs and it's portable.
Absolutely.
And they won't even talk about this.
They won't, and it's a real shame, because Utah, several years ago, for new employees, moved to a defined contribution or a 401k style plan. And Pennsylvania, just a couple of weeks ago, passed a bill, and the governor signed a bill to move new employees into a split defined benefit, 50% defined benefit, 50% defined contribution plan, which of course severely limits the risk to taxpayers for the new employees, and also to give older employees who were in a DB defined contribution plan, or defined benefit plan rather, the option of moving into the full defined contribution plan or the new hybrid plan that they
even if
have.
they've been working for the
Even-
government
right.
for 20 years,
Right.
they can switch over and get a certain amount of lump sum money.
Absolutely.
And it seems to me if you do the calculations, to have a lump sum of money that is yours that they can't take might be a whole lot better than a promise you hope they will keep.
It's going to be very attractive to a lot of their employees.
Let me ask you the actuarial question, which is, all right, if Colorado were to do something like that and switch people over, the big, you can't do that because you can't do that because we need the money coming in from new employees into the pension system to pay. So instead of a 401k where we add money and it's yours, here we have a system where we're ripping off money from younger employees to pay the older ones. If you take away that, who's going to pay for the older retirees?
Well, and that's actually a reasonable argument, except that you're still on the, in order to get that money for the SB1 reforms that were passed in 2010, basically said that new employees would be paying more into the system than older employees were getting in order to help over a long period of time alleviate this. And so that's exactly their argument. We won't have that money coming in. The problem is that in order to do that, in order to get that money from the newer employees, you're making promises to them as well. So the unfunded liability has the potential to continue to grow over time.
Real fast, we've got half a minute. Can Colorado bring in the reforms that Utah and you said Pennsylvania have? Is that a realistic thing that could happen here?
If the political will exists to do it, it absolutely can happen here. If Utah and Pennsylvania, two very different states, can do that, absolutely Colorado can do it. The question is, do we have the will to make that change?
And it's also one of those problems, the longer we wait, the bigger the problem and the bigger the hurt is going to be when this falls apart. Joshua Sharf, thank you. Check out Joshua's work at independenceinstitute.org. Listen for me on KHOW Radio. Read me in the Post. We'll see you next week.